now. Hello to everybody and welcome to United Europe's panel discussion tonight. Brexit riots, Brussels problem. On our panel tonight we have Amanda Ferguson, Neil Richmond, Emma de Souza and Robert Ramsey. And our moderator for the evening is Tony Connolly from RT, which is the Irish state broadcaster, and he's the European correspondent for it. As you know, United Europe is a non-profit association with the goal of promoting the diversity, unity and competitiveness of Europe. The format of the discussion this evening will be the panel discussion, and there may be time towards the end for questions and answers at Tony Connolly's discretion. And at the end, we'll have a short wrap up. I'll tell you one or two more things about United Europe. Over to you, Tony.
Thank you very much, James, and good evening, everybody, wherever you are. It's great to moderate this panel. We've got a really interesting, eclectic mix of voices and opinions with the panel, but we'd be delighted to hear your voices and opinions as well, and any questions you might have. So wherever you are across Europe, we are delighted to welcome you and hope we can shed some light on what's been happening in Northern Ireland and Brexit and the riots which have been on our TV screens recently. A lot to explain, a lot to explore, and I'm delighted to welcome a number of people who will do just that. We have Amanda Ferguson, who's a Belfast-based freelance journalist, a very well-known journalist and broadcaster based in Belfast, who has been writing and broadcasting deeply and significantly as well on a lot of the issues around the rioting and Brexit and the peace process. We also have Emma de Souza, who is an extremely accomplished citizens' rights campaigner. She's fought long and hard for rights regarding herself and her partner, regarding the Good Friday Agreement, citizenship, nationality, all of those issues. And she's currently based in Fermanagh, but she's regarded as one of the next generation peacemakers in Northern Ireland. Delighted once again to welcome Neil Richmond, who is a Fine Gael TD, that's an MP in the Rathdown Dublin constituency. Neil has been a stellar figure throughout the Brexit process. He is a regular fixture on British and international television, explaining the Irish position, explaining the complexities of the Irish border and how Brexit has impacted on Ireland. And he has a very balanced and thought-provoking position always on the Irish question and the national question, and I hope he can explore some of those themes tonight. And finally, last but not least, Robert Ramsey, who was a key figure and a very senior civil servant with the power sharing executive back in the early 70s. He was with the last Northern Ireland government and served as a permanent secretary to Brian Faulkner, the last Northern Ireland Prime Minister, before direct rule came in. And then he followed his trajectory towards Whitehall, and then beyond that to the European Commission. And he's been deeply involved at so many levels in Northern Ireland administration, politics, peace funding for Northern Ireland from the European Union. And I think he will have a very rounded view of the recent history of Northern Ireland and the effect that Brexit has had on the political and sectarian situation, if you like, that is unfolding at the moment. But certainly we are in a very challenging period at the moment. The Northern Ireland Protocol has been in effect since the 1st of January, and it's fair to say that it has had a fairly rough ride since then. We've had a number of big political crises and flashpoints between the UK government and the European Commission, with the Irish government somehow caught in between. We have a situation where unionism in Northern Ireland has completely turned against the Northern Ireland Protocol from a position where it seemed to take a somewhat pragmatic view of the protocol on the 1st of January. We've had the whole upheaval over the Article 16 misadventure by the European Commission in connection with vaccines back at the end of January. And we've had, of course, the riots in Belfast. Now, just to start on that point, Amanda Ferguson, you've been reporting widely on the riots. Can you give people a sense, a kind of a reporter's eye view sense of how that all unfolded and what you think were the main drivers behind it?
I think that there's not just one simple, neat reason, which I've tried to explain many times. And sometimes when I'm broadcasting, people want you to wrap it up in 30 seconds, but it's impossible to do that. I think the big picture is about insecurity, about the future of Northern Ireland, about the change in demographics and the political landscape. Then, of course, tension has been building since the new year over the Brexit protocol. And then one of the triggers for the violence that we saw was the PPS decision not to prosecute senior Sinn Féin members.
That's the public prosecutor, just for people who are not familiar with that. Yeah. So yeah, if you give us a bit of the background to that issue.
Yes, so in June 2020, a sort of senior Sinn Féin figure, a former IRA intelligence chief, his funeral took place in June of 2020, and that was at the very sort of start of lockdown, whenever the restrictions were at their most severe and numbers were limited. Now, it would have been, obviously someone like Bobby Storey is either a hate figure for some or a hero for others. So up to 2,000 people gathered on the streets, and then the police recommended that the PPS, the Public Prosecution Service, prosecute over COVID breaches. So 24 senior Sinn Féin members were interviewed around that, and then the prosecutors took the decision that they weren't going to go forward with prosecutions because they felt that a reasonable excuse defence could be raised on two different grounds. One, that the COVID law at the time was incoherent, and the other one was around the fact that the organisers had engaged with the police. So what we saw in the aftermath of that decision from the prosecutors was unionist anger turned slightly away from Sinn Féin and on to the police chief constable. So there were calls for the director of the Public Prosecution Service to resign, calls for the police chief constable to resign. And then we saw just really angry sort of utterances, and the public discourse was pretty toxic, and politicians became engaged in a blame game over who was responsible. Was it Sinn Féin for one rule for them and a different rule from everybody else? And what we then saw was violence unfolding. Now, there was also criminal and paramilitary elements involved in the violence that we saw. There's been built-in tensions around claims around two-tier policing, which is a loyalist view that they're policed differently to their Irish nationalist and Republican neighbours. But the difficulty whenever that argument comes in is that there's about half a dozen different groups that claim there's two-tier policing, including people who are anti-vaxxers, people from the Black Lives Matter demonstrations, feminist protesters, there's Irish Republicans. There's a range of people who are unhappy with the police. So I'm not sure that particular argument stacks up. And then we also know that social deprivation and lockdown fatigue and an element of what we would call recreational rioting has also played into this as well. So
that's a uniquely Northern Irish phenomenon, I think.
Yeah, so while Brexit is one of the reasons, and it's certainly causing a lot of distress to people of a unionist loyalist background, it's not the only reason that we found ourselves in the media spotlight over violence.
I mean, just for those who might not be that familiar with the Northern Ireland Protocol, essentially it is the agreement reached between the British government and the European Union as a way of avoiding a hard border on the island of Ireland. But it just means that there will be checks and controls on goods coming from Great Britain into Northern Ireland to avoid the border on the land. But of course, the border then had to move to the Irish Sea. So to unionists, that is a dilution of their identity. It means they feel themselves treated differently from the rest of the United Kingdom. And the whole question of being a unionist is that you want to maintain the union between Northern Ireland and Great Britain. But it's fair to say, I think, Amanda, that the political landscape in Northern Ireland has been anything but serene over the past few years.
Yes, it's a mandatory coalition government, and at the very top of it, you have British Unionists who want to remain part of the UK, and you've got Irish Republicans who want Irish reunification. So I think that while the argument around the protocol is that Northern Ireland didn't get the same Brexit as the rest of the United Kingdom, I think it should always be made clear that no matter what the trading arrangements are, that the constitutional position of Northern Ireland is that it remains part of the UK unless people would vote for it to become reunified. So sort of talk around slippery slopes to economic United Ireland and a United Ireland by the back door, that's not grounded in reality, particularly because we know that in certain areas of the economy that Brexit causes divergence between the two jurisdictions on the island of Ireland. So it's a tough one for people who are not quite into the minutiae of Northern Ireland to wrap their heads around. It's complicated, but certainly it's something that needs to be addressed by both the UK government and the EU, because they're the people that agreed the deal.
Of course, the Good Friday Agreement, which you mentioned there, is at the centre of the kind of tug of war that has gone on between the UK and the European Union, with Ireland kind of in the middle. Both sides now have kind of claimed that the arrangements threaten the Good Friday Agreement, and the Unionists now say that the Northern Ireland Protocol completely overturns the Good Friday Agreement. But if I can just move to you, Emma de Souza, I mean, your activism and campaigning has been based on the Good Friday Agreement, but specifically on the issue of citizens' rights. Can you just remind people of your own campaign briefly, if you can? Thanks.
Certainly. In terms of my own campaign, it was based around the Good Friday Agreement right to be accepted as Irish or British or both. I'm an Irish citizen, and I went through a half a decade long court battle with the British Home Office in order to have that right to be accepted as Irish under the terms of the Good Friday Agreement, accepted by the Home Office to stabilise my husband's status within Northern Ireland. We were
successful. Your husband is from where exactly?
He's from the US, from
America.
Okay. So we were successful in getting substantive changes to domestic UK immigration law that mean all the people of Northern Ireland will be treated as EU citizens for immigration purposes. But this was a temporary fix that does not address some of the underlying issues around citizenship and identity in the Good Friday Agreement, and will actually pose a bit of a problem after June this year.
Okay, and just can you bring us up to date on your case? Where are things at for your husband at the moment?
Well, he's in the process of becoming an Irish citizen, so we're very excited about that, a part of the Irish nation. But his status was stabilised after the Home Office and the UK government changed domestic immigration law last May and enabled him to finally be here as a spouse of an Irish citizen and accepted me under the terms of the Good Friday Agreement. So our case is finally over.
Yeah, okay, well that's great. What has your own view been of what's been happening on the streets in Belfast and Derry and other parts of Northern Ireland? You know, given how uniquely you have been challenged by Brexit and the whole question of identity and citizens' rights and so on.
It's been really difficult to watch these scenes unfold, in particular because of how young many of the participants in these riots have been, with children as young as 12 being caught up in the violence. And it serves, I think, as a very important reminder of the challenges in peace building. You know, the Good Friday Agreement was not the end, but the beginning of a process of reconciliation, and it requires constant work. And whenever we see, we see conversations around, well, what's motivating children onto the streets, what's causing them to be out there, it's not based purely around, as Amanda has said, the Northern Ireland Protocol or any one issue, but really a very complex undercurrent of issues in terms of deprivation, poverty, lack of educational outcomes, and the influence that paramilitary organizations do still hold in working class areas. And I think that it's very important now to reflect on the progress or lack of progress over the last 2 decades, because many of the rights-based provisions of the Good Friday Agreement have not been properly utilized or implemented into law. It's issues such as integrated education, mixed housing, investment into these areas. These all form part of the Good Friday Agreement, and I would really like to see sort of a recommitment to the aspirations on those pages to try and address some of these wider issues in these areas, and I think that that's where our focus should lie.
I mean, has Brexit and the British government's kind of posture in the Brexit negotiations, I'm thinking mainly in terms of European Court of Human Rights, the British government keeping the Human Rights Act. Have those issues been resolved to a degree that would give you reassurance that kind of flank of rights is going to be protected post-Brexit?
Not at all, not even a little bit. There's certainly a lot of concern around any diversions from the ECHR, the Human Rights Act, and we're not convinced that that's not going to happen. In terms of also ensuring that the identity and citizenship provisions of the Good Friday Agreement are fully implemented and adhered to, we don't have commitments from the government on that. And certainly for me, as someone who spent the time during the Brexit negotiations, I was in court with the British government on rights under the Good Friday Agreement. And so to hear the constant sound bites of being fully committed to the Good Friday Agreement while simultaneously dragging citizens through the court over rights enshrined in the Good Friday Agreement was very difficult for me to have to endure. And I think that there is a duplicity at times in terms of this commitment, and it requires really constant work from political representatives, but also from civic society and activists to keep pushing for these rights to be fully protected and fully implemented. We don't get given anything when it comes to the Good Friday Agreement. We have to really push to get these rights fully adhered to. So I would have a lot of concerns over diminution of rights after Brexit. I think it's also worth noting that there's a big issue around parity of esteem in that we do now have a situation where British citizens and Irish citizens in Northern Ireland do hold a different set of rights, which in essence undermines the parity of esteem and mutual respect and equality provisions of the Good Friday Agreement itself. So it really is quite a difficult time, and it's quite complex because the Good Friday Agreement didn't envision Brexit. And really the joint membership of the UK and Ireland and Northern Ireland in the EU was what provided the scaffolding for the Good Friday Agreement. And now we don't have that scaffolding anymore, and we don't really know how it's going to fare out. So certainly would have a lot of concerns around the diminution of rights post-Brexit.
Okay, thanks very much, Emma. Neil Richmond, I'm not sure if you're a scaffolding expert, but are you concerned about the structures that need to be either put in place or revived in order to try and restore some of that degree of cooperation and rapport between the British and Irish governments in the sense that they're both co-guarantors of the Good Friday Agreement?
I think the structures are absolutely in place and the structures are sound, but it's down to both the British and Irish government as well as political leadership in Northern Ireland to embrace those structures. So it doesn't matter if you're a constitutional unionist or someone who seeks a united Ireland, you should believe in the structures of the Good Friday Agreement. They make sense. But what
and just specifically, what the structures you have in mind, can you spell them out for people? Yeah.
Well, the ones that I'm particularly concerned about, Tony, is for a start, the British-Irish Intergovernmental Conference hasn't met since 2018. It would have been an ample opportunity last week for a meeting to be held. Last week, the North-South Ministerial Council on transport issues didn't meet because a unionist representative wasn't able to partake. We have this situation where the British-Irish Council is attended by the Taoiseach, the various First Ministers of devolved administrations, but rarely the British Prime Minister. And it seems when Emma talks about parity of esteem within the Good Friday Agreement, that parity of esteem between nations and administrations also needs to be respected. And that also, I suppose, moves into the wider discussion about the implementation of the Northern Irish Protocol and the work of the Joint Implementation Committee, where the British government has signed up to an agreement in good faith. This British government negotiated and signed up to it, but is still lagging behind massively in terms of implementation and acting in a unilateral manner, which has been really difficult for the Irish government in particular, because so much political capital has been spent within the European Union by the Irish government to say that it's important to continue to work with the British government to allow the space to ensure that we can make the protocol work. But then you have the British government rubbishing the protocol that it negotiated itself in its own press to assuage a domestic audience, and you have unionist politicians in Northern Ireland who sought Brexit, who campaigned for Brexit, now targeting everything on the protocol as being the destabilising problem at the heart of this matter. And it puts everyone in a bit of a bind. But in order to, I suppose, ensure that we can have a working relationship, north-south, east-west, everyone has to buy into what has been agreed and what has been signed up on. And for those who say there isn't consent amongst unionism for the protocol. Well, there's quite clearly not consent in Northern Ireland for Brexit from the outset.
What was it like from your perspective in Dublin, watching the riots? I mean, they seem to have abated for the moment, but was there a fear that they could actually get out of control and that there could have been coordinated demonstrations at interface areas that would really provoke an escalation? Somebody loses their life potentially. How does that affect the Irish government's position in this? Because the Irish government is co-guarantor. It has a responsibility under the Good Friday Agreement. You know, it shares the same piece of earth with everyone in Northern Ireland, and you know, it's kind of in their lap in a sense. But yet the Irish government has to be part of the European mainstream and the European Union mainstream. And as you say, having invested so much capital, political capital, in resolving the Brexit dilemma, it can't have been a very comfortable few weeks for the Irish government.
No, and the few weeks preceding it were equally as difficult when you had things like our Deputy Prime Minister and our Minister for Foreign Affairs' home addresses put up on walls in forms of graffiti in loyalist and unionist areas. That was really quite worrying. And I think both Emma and Amanda alluded to the sight of 12 and 13-year-old children being arrested on the streets was really dispiriting. These were people who were born considerably after the peace was won and the Good Friday Agreement was signed. And it was quite clear from the reporting of many people that there were I suppose, nefarious actors directing young children out on the streets to throw rocks, petrol bombs, and we saw a literal child putting a petrol bomb into a moving bus, which was really quite harrowing. It was also then, you have to balance the concern about the outside view and people who are automatically saying this is a return to the Troubles. And all of you on the panel know what the Troubles were like a lot better than I do. But it wasn't a return. And I don't think we're going back to that place, but it just shows that this is a continuously delicate situation. And I've been very critical of politicians in my own jurisdiction over the last 2 decades, that once the Good Friday Agreement was signed, far too many simply detached and switched off from the conversation in relation to what was happening on the ground in Northern Ireland in terms of reconciliation, in terms of making a mandatory coalition work, in terms of holding the British government accountable to their responsibilities under the Good Friday Agreement. And it just shows how neither the British or Irish governments can ever afford to switch off. And this relationship, north-south, east-west, thrown into a European context post-Brexit, it's never going to be done. Brexit's not going to be done, but the resolution to the very difficult situation that presents itself on the island of Ireland is also never going to be done. And it requires continuous engagement, but real engagement, acknowledging responsibilities as well as opportunities.
Robert Ramsey, if I can bring you in there, would it be too cynical to say that underneath it all, despite the Good Friday Agreement, the peace process, the ceasefires, the peace funding, the reconciliation money that has come in, that new sense of peace and normality, if you like, in Belfast and Derry and other places, that underneath all of that, it didn't take that much for the two tribes, if that's not too derogatory, to be at each other's throats again. Do you think this is something that is simply endemic to the divide in Northern Ireland, given your own experience of so many years as an administrator, as a civil servant who was so close to efforts to try and bring about a reconciliation and some peace and development?
Well, first of all, I'd like to say that I agree entirely with what Amanda said at the beginning, her analysis of what the young rioters were up to. I read the foreign press, and there were tales of, are we going back to civil war and so on? And that's completely exaggerated. One mustn't play down how serious it is to see rioting, particularly with the young people. But I think that that's just part of an overall frustration. And the biggest factor in that, I think, was not the details of the protocol, but as Amanda rightly put out, it was the spectacle of the IRA Sinn Féin funeral. I mean, it's hard to outside to appreciate just the provocation that was, because at a time when everyone else was locked down here, and it's so TV is makes such a visual impact, that here was not just a few, but 2,000 people strutting in the streets in defiance of the law. And of course, the police, and particularly the way the police was led, made a real mess of it. I mean, that may come out in the inquiry that's ongoing and is due to report, I think, in the middle of next month. But that's just one aspect. And just to take what the young people were doing, I think the most authentic voice in that is actually the Carl Frampton, the boxer, who comes from Tiger Bay, one of the areas involved. And he admitted that in his youth, that he was a very happy rioter. And you've got to, I mean, it sounds flippant to say recreational rioting, but that was part of it. But there is a much wider thing, and that is the frustration. Some of the elements of that frustration is that particularly the sort of DUP supporters realized that they were duped by Johnson, that they have been thrown under the bus on that. But behind that, there's an even greater frustration that a lot of the very good things in the Good Friday Agreement, particularly the improvement that it made possible between Belfast and Dublin, London, etc. There are things there that the unionists can do nothing about, but greatly frustrate them when they see murderers becoming ministers, but they can do so on the basis of an electoral democratic mandate. So there's nothing the unions can do about that. There's nothing they can do about the fact that the consequences of Brexit seem to be to their disadvantage. And so there's this great frustration, and you can see them gradually working into a very Irish thing, ironically, of victimhood. I mean, you guys who are non-British unionists have raised victimhood to a new peak as a political art form. And now you're going to see it the other way around, because there are so many frustrations there and no obvious solutions to them. It may be that over the next few years that Northern Ireland's half in, half out relationship with the EU through continuation in the single market and the customs union, that hardly anyone is talking about the advantages of that. And I couldn't offer a speculation as to whether that will turn out to be in Northern Ireland's favor or not. It may be, but you could see in the future that the next few years are going to be very decisive. And what will happen, at one level, you might see Brexit Britain getting into difficulties, whereas EU Ireland flourishing. That's one extreme scenario. It could be the other way around. And a lot of things will, I'm personally a bit anxious about the fact that in less than 5 years' time, Stormont of all places, not our population, but just the guys at Stormont will take a decision as to whether that should be continued or not. And I think that that's far too soon. And I'm worried about that for the where will all these frustrations on the unionist side lead, not in a very positive way.
I mean, do you think that unionism is in a bit of a corner, a dead end at the moment? And if so, is this a very unique situation? I mean, I know it's often said that there is the innate kind of siege mentality going back hundreds of years, but are they now in as tight a spot as they have ever been? Because the British government, who would be their own guarantors, are beholden to an international treaty signed with the European Union, which is a different creature to the Good Friday Agreement, even though it is an international treaty as well. What are the what kind of exit strategy does unionism have?
Well, I think they're thrashing around. I mean, they feel let down by London, and they realise that that there's a large body of opinion in the establishment, particularly in London, that looks on Northern Ireland as being a sort of an ingrowing toenail on the body politic. They would just like to get rid of it, but they do honour to a certain extent their constitutional responsibilities. But they hope that, as their predecessors hoped, 100 years ago, that the partition would only be something that would last for a short time, and that the two sides would get together at some point. But they're very wary, on the other hand, of what the Dublin position would be. I mean, if we look at the current Taoiseach, from a unionist point of view, he's a vast improvement over predecessors, particularly somebody like Charles Haughey, who came across as the real villain of the piece to unionists. But what he has been trying to do with the shared island unit and so on, that's a very delicate thing. That, I mean, I would have rather seen it being couched in saying, at a much preliminary stage of saying, how do we increase good neighborliness, and concentrate on that, rather than having the sort of presumptions of saying, well, sooner or later, you guys are going to have to come into an all-Ireland framework, and how do we do that? And what they talk about, what anyone has talked about, is saying, well, of course, we would respect the identity of the unionists, but they don't put any sort of flesh on that, nor do the unionists put flesh on it and say, how would we have our identity and our traditions respected? And if it just boils down to saying, well, of course, you guys, you can blatter lambeg drums, and you're going to have bonfires on the 11th night, and you can walk about traditional routes in orange regalia on the 12th of July, and what more do you want? And that's a sort of Morris dancer, folklorique sort of thing. I haven't seen anything that's from either side on that makes any sense.
Yeah, but I think we can come back to Neil Richmond on that subject, because he's written very thoughtfully and spoken very thoughtfully a lot about identity and a shared island, and what unionism might look like in a possibly a united Ireland, or whether that's just a contradiction in terms. But I just have a question I'd like to bring in from Ailish Campbell, who apparently is the Canadian ambassador to the EU. Very good to have you, Ambassador. She wanted to hear more about Amanda's point about demographics, and then question about Northern Ireland attracting immigrants, I presume from Eastern Europe or from other parts of the European Union, and some of the arrangements there for immigration controls. I think that's a question linked to the common travel area. But let's just hear Amanda, if we may, first of all, on the demographics factor. If you might just explain that, Amanda, for us. Thank you.
Yes, just first of all, I'd like just to address Robert's point whenever he mentioned about the fallout from the funeral. As much as that was a major issue, it is something that happened 10 months ago, and it was very upsetting to grieving families, but not everybody is as angry about it as perhaps politicians would suggest that they are. And I think that some of the violence was as much about the political reaction to the prosecutor's decision, and the angry unionist reaction towards the leadership of police, that almost it felt as if people who were itching to be violent used it as a justification for their behavior. So it seemed as if it was like, okay, well, the leadership of unionism is turning on the police, so we are as well. Now, obviously, there's no justification for the violence, and all of the parties condemn that, but I think that's a pretty specific point that needs to be put into it. And whenever I'm talking about demographics, you know, it's the centenary of Northern Ireland this year. Some people want to celebrate it, some people want to mark it and discuss it, and other people want absolutely nothing to do with it because it's deeply upsetting to them that it would even be marked in the first place. Where we find ourselves in Northern Ireland in 2021 is a very different place to where we were 10 years ago, 20 years ago. You know, whenever I was turning, you know, 18 and the Good Friday Agreement, you know, the opportunity to vote for that came up. You know, it's a very, very different place. Unionism lost its majority at the Assembly. We're roughly divided now into sort of three groups. There's the Unionist group, the Republican group, and the others. So there's a sense that perhaps unionism hasn't been prepared for what it feels like to be a minority. I think that that's something that plays into what we're dealing with now, because you know, there's a sense perhaps that the police service as it is now, even though it isn't, you know, fully reflective of the society that we live in, it's not the police service that perhaps many unionists will have grown up with. I think that whenever we're talking, you know, all the time it's about orange and green, about Irish and British, and there's very little room for others. There's very little room for alternative viewpoints. And I think that, you know, whenever I speak to people who are from migrant communities, there's a sense that they're viewed as an addition to society rather than part of society. And I think that we need to get to grips with the fact that the place that you know, I grew up in, where it was pretty much all white faces, is changing, and it's changing for the better, but there isn't that sort of inclusiveness that there could be. So I think that if you look at the demographics, I don't have the exact figures on me now, but the sense is that most of the older population are from the unionist community, and most of the children seem to be from what will be a sort of Irish nationalist community. So that, you know, it's going to change over the years, the voting strength or the sort of political strength that there is among parties. And at the moment, the biggest party in Northern Ireland is the Democratic Unionist Party. It's that pro-British party. But the second biggest party are Sinn Féin, who are Irish Republicans. They also have an all-island presence. They also have elected politicians in Neil's jurisdiction. So that's what I was talking about at the very start, about there being an uneasiness and a sort of insecurity about what the future holds. And I think that how I always like to view it is that no matter what happens, whether Northern Ireland remains part of the United Kingdom or whether it you know, reunifies or becomes a new island or a new Ireland or whatever you want to call it, nobody's going anywhere. There's still going to be people who have a very strong British identity, people who have an Irish identity, and all of the other people that have made this place their home, and that all has to be respected. And it could actually be a selling point for us that the northern part of the island that I live on has such a sort of a rich British culture, rich Irish culture, and other cultures as well. And I don't think that that is taken into consideration enough whenever we're having these sort of conversations.
Yeah, thanks, Amanda. I mean, just, you know, gleaning the sort of sentiment on social media. I mean, and those people who oppose Brexit and who have got very strong views on the Irish question are very quick to say, you know, you voted for it, own it. This is what you wanted. This is the protocol that Boris Johnson negotiated. But just getting back to the title of the discussion, Belfast riots or riots in Northern Ireland, is that Brussels' problem now? Does Brussels have, as Katie Hayward would say, you know, a duty of care to both sides or all sides of the community in Northern Ireland? I mean, just briefly on that, Amanda, and then I'll maybe put the same question to Emma on that.
Yes, I think it definitely does. I think that a lot of this sort of frustration and anger is around perceptions more than it is around reality, because you have to consider the huge number of people who are Irish within Northern Ireland for the last 100 years, and it hasn't diminished their Irishness in anywhere. They're as Irish today as they were yesterday and will be no matter what happens. So I think I had actually been hopeful that Irish Republicans and British Unionists could have learned from each other's feelings, that perhaps the sense of uneasiness and frustration and distress that the protocol is causing to Unionists could have perhaps made Republicans reflect a bit more on how they were feeling, because they know how they feel to a certain extent. And I would have thought that hopefully that it would have given Unionists an insight to perhaps how people in Northern Ireland who are Irish feel about existing within a British state. But certainly the EU and the UK both have a responsibility. I don't think anybody would say that the protocol is perfect. It definitely needs to be finessed, even if it's just over simple things. You know, whenever I'm asking people, how is this protocol affecting your day-to-day life? For some people, there's absolutely no difference at all. Other people, there's maybe some fruit that they can't get that they wanted to get before. But for other people, there's, you know, issues around, you know, buying items that they want to, ordering from places that no longer want to deal with Northern Ireland.
Well,
So
there are obviously grace periods there at the moment, which perhaps suggest that the full impact hasn't happened yet.
Yeah, but even such a thing as, you know, bringing dogs, you know, bringing your dog home from Britain to Northern Ireland. I think that there's some things that seem absurd about the protocol. It seems as if it's maybe a little on the strict side of things, but you know, this is what the EU and the UK have agreed to. So hopefully, you know, that sense of betrayal that unionists feel from the British government and from Boris Johnson can be eased in some way. But it's definitely something that both the UK government and the EU need to take very seriously, because all the grievances that existed before, you know, some of the street violence that we saw unfold, they're still there, and there's potential for them to flare again. And you know, that's just taken into account that the protocol is just one of the factors that have led to that.
Yeah, Emma, can I ask you, from your perspective, do you think Brussels does have a duty of care, that this is now as much Brussels' responsibility, the EU's responsibility, as it is the British and Irish governments?
Thank you, Tony. And yes, I actually was wondering if I could elaborate a little bit on the demographics for Ailish quickly first, and the common travel area, and then answer that question around the protocol. Would that be okay?
Sure, absolutely, yes. Thank you.
I just want to expand on what Amanda has already said around the shifting demographics in Northern Ireland. You know, the Life and Time survey shows that a majority of people no longer identify as unionist or nationalist in Northern Ireland. And we have seen a real increase in the others, as they are sometimes referred to, in terms of that plurality of identity in the north. We also have seen a substantial increase in those choosing to become a part of the Irish nation. Within the past 10 years alone, over 830,000 Irish passports have been issued to citizens in Northern Ireland. We've also seen a decrease in those choosing to hold a British passport. So that may be also an effect of Brexit as well, in that the Irish passport and being a part of the Irish nation now carries with it EU rights and entitlements, and we see people choosing now to have the opportunities that entails. So there really has been a substantial shift in the demographics, especially since 1998. And around the common travel area, in terms of immigrants, there are tens of thousands of EU citizens in Northern Ireland and across the island of Ireland. The common travel area does not allow them to freely travel, in terms of it doesn't apply to them. The common travel area applies only to those who are British and Irish. And this does create concerns around the common travel area, and those who are EU citizens on the island, they have to get frontier visas. There's uncertainty around checks happening on the border, which shouldn't necessarily be happening at all. And we're also seeing an increase in racism in terms of common travel area checks. So there is a whole raft of concerns there around immigrants on the island of Ireland and how the common travel area is going to affect them. And then on the point of the protocol, you know, Northern Ireland is a post-conflict society, and so it has to be seen through that lens. And there is a responsibility on both the UK and the EU when it comes to implementation and monitoring of the protocol. So yes, there is a responsibility on both sides in terms of sustaining and stabilising the peace process in Northern Ireland. In my view, there was really no form of Brexit that could satiate the desires of hardline Brexiteers and protect the Good Friday Agreement. And we're seeing now, you know, the Northern Ireland Protocol is not perfect. There's lots of improvement that we could have, maybe around SBS checks and looking at finding other agreements to put in place, and grace periods, and just finding a little bit of imagination and flexibility in order to alleviate some of the concerns coming from unionist communities. But what really is necessary now is honesty, in terms of honesty from political leaders in Northern Ireland on what the protocol actually does and what impact it has on them. You know, I don't buy into the argument that 12-year-olds and 13-year-olds and 14-year-olds were on the street throwing rocks because of trade agreements or customs checks, nor do I buy that they were so outraged by a funeral that took place 10 months ago that got them onto the streets either. There's lots of complex issues that need to be addressed here, and they're going to have to be done so with the generosity of spirit that the Good Friday Agreement entails.
Okay, thanks very much, Emma. Neil Richmond, if I can come to you again. Robert has talked about the predicament that unionism finds itself in, and that predicament must surely feel a lot worse if you're a unionist when people say, well, Brexit is going to bring a United Ireland to happen a lot quicker. Now, you've talked about this due to your own background. I mean, if you can just explain to people what your own background is and how you think the Venn diagram of unionism versus Irish nationalism can ever be untangled and resolved.
I must say, when we talk about identity, and it's perhaps because the audience are on, I'm immediately drawn to the mental image of myself and James standing outside the Grapevine on Place Luxembourg as I signed Irish passport application forms for a very close friend who voted against the Good Friday Agreement. And it kind of shows how things have progressed over the last couple of years, but they were legible and they were approved and the passport was delivered. But I suppose my background in Southern Irish politics is quite different in that I come from the minority Protestant tradition. My grandfather would have been an Orangeman, and my grandparents would have all considered themselves British, even though they were born before partition south of what has become the border. And certainly the vast majority of my family is either living in Northern Ireland or what they would consider the mainland in England and Scotland, and they would all be from the Unionist tradition. My summers as a kid were going up as to Emma's home place now or Fermanagh to go to the swimming pool in Enniskillen and visit cousins, and also occasionally stand on the curbside watching uncles and granduncles march in orange parades. So it's not an alien culture to me, but I don't pretend to say that I can understand the feeling, the besieged feeling that unionists feel at the moment. And I think that is a very understandable feeling. And Robert has mentioned very eloquently how many unionists feel let down by London, and I do accept that. But I think political unionism has perhaps misled and let down the people it claims to represent. And I think that's something that we have to mention, that the largest unionist party in Northern Ireland campaigned for a Brexit, and they never laid out clearly what the consequences would be. This was the same party that held the balance and power in Westminster for the two most important years of the Brexit negotiations, voted against every workable solution to the problems Brexit causes on this island. And now we're in a situation where their sole solution to the issues that the protocol present is that the protocol should be abandoned. But we have yet to receive any workable alternatives. I'll make exception to the Ulster Unionist parties who have presented alternatives. I don't deem them workable, but at least they are something. And I think we have to be quite clear when you have leading unionist MPs like Ian Paisley going on BBC Newsnight with me and saying shelves across Northern Ireland are empty, people feel a complete detachment. I think that doesn't do his constituents or his cause any favours. And particularly when someone like Simon Coveney, who's working so hard within the European Commission to develop those flexibilities around grace periods and around exemptions, is then portrayed as the bogeyman and saying that Dublin's sole interest in this is, as Kate Hoey, an English politician, albeit one from Northern Ireland, has said, that Dublin has always weaponized the peace process, which I think is grossly unfair, and it's very cynical to take that approach. I think we have a situation now where we look at the realities that Brexit means borders. There had to be checks and inspections somewhere if the UK wanted to leave the European Union. And the current British government has chosen a particularly hard form of Brexit, which means that there is a need for far more inspections. So a number of inspections at ports of entry into Northern Ireland, be they Warrenpoint or Belfast Port, that are relatively light touch, all things considered at the moment, are a stark contrast to the potential alternative of having checks between Ireland and Northern Ireland across, I don't know how many times you and I have said it over the last 5 years, Tony, nearly 500 kilometres of a working border that has a very difficult history. I think if we just take a step back, and this isn't in any way to try and antagonize unionism, far from it, it's the complete opposite. It's to talk about how we can actually get workable solutions. Simply demanding that the protocol is thrown away is not a workable solution. And the very opportune title of this seminar is this Brussels' problem? Yes and no. It's as much Brussels' problem as it is London's problem. And when the Irish government within the EU is talking about trust, political capital, and then you have a British government that still hasn't met their initial responsibilities of a treaty they signed and they negotiated, you have to ask questions. And I think it's Mara Sefcovic was speaking earlier when he talked about there is imaginations and there is things that London can do. And Emma talked about veterinary agreements, but also SPS agreements and all these things. But ultimately, when we talk about being generous in situations, we had a very narrow referendum result in the United Kingdom, and yet we've got the hardest form of Brexit. Whereas if there was a far softer Brexit looked for, a lot of the situations that we're presented now wouldn't have been there. And I think certainly in this situation, when we're trying to find practical solutions, we owe the people we represented as public representatives the responsibility to be honest with them. And we also owe those who don't agree with us to be honest with them. But we have to bring it back to the ability to disagree without being disagreeable at every point.
Thanks, Neil. Robert, if I might just bring you in at this point, the border that Neil has described there, Boris Johnson last night said that it would be very, very many years, I think, to quote him directly, before there was a border poll or a referendum on a united Ireland. Is that your view? Do you think that ultimately it's going to be a long way away for both governments? And Neil might want to come back in on this, but I mean, the Irish government has made no secret of the fact that it's not in any mad rush to have another referendum after Brexit on something like unity. What's your view of how that conversation is going to be managed over the coming years?
Well, I think that the current Dublin government has been very responsible in saying, no, that would be divisive and so on. But I think that the people who think that, well, if you had a poll pretty soon, that the demographics are moving in favor of voting in favor of reunification. But I think that overlooks a fact, and that is that if we take the period between the Good Friday Agreement and the Brexit referendum, that if there had been a vote in that period, you couldn't just do it on a head count between Protestants and Catholics, to put it at its crudest level, because there was a very interesting socio-economic factor there, namely that the growing Catholic middle class, the people, the professionals or the commercial people and so on, while they were never going to vote for a unionist politician, if it came to a referendum, then they would be tempted to say, well, we have got over a bad period in our history. Things have changed with the Good Friday Agreement, and economically and in terms of health service and all of that, that's a positive thing for the UK. And also, they were not so keen on a lot of things that had happened in Dublin that had been brought to light in all the various tribunals there, with not to mention the arms trial and all of that. And they weren't so keen on people like Charlie Haughey, who was, as some of them said, the cutest of the cute ones, as you very nearly say in Dublin. So that would have been a factor. And that can be flipped on the other side. If we look into the future and it comes to a poll then it will be the deciding factor in the middle, I think, will be the Protestant middle class, that they will then look and see, well, if Irish unity is looming, and if we assume that Brexit Britain is going down and European Union Ireland going up, then, well, perhaps this would be the moment that you could see it going that way. But I mean, that's in the future, and I wouldn't like to put my money on it either way. But it must be said in all of this that Brexit has been a tragedy, particularly for Northern Ireland, because up until that, you could have seen that within the framework of the EU, that the differences north-south were gradually fading, and there was a greater acceptance of membership there. And I think the DUP, I mean, Paisleyism has been a terrible, terrible tragedy for unionism. I mean, they're the forerunners. I mean, the great tragedy for Northern Ireland is that the majority community has voted for somebody who was way out of kilter with history generally, who was a ranting bigot, let's face it. And the majority on the other side, have voted for a gang of murderers. I mean, that is a terrible tragedy for our society. And it will take a long time, if ever, that we will get that resolved in whatever framework there is there for the future.
Thanks, Robert. Emma, can I just go to you briefly, and then I'll just see if there are any further questions. But I mean, I think you or Amanda or both talked about the emerging middle in Northern Ireland who don't necessarily cling to the label or the identity of unionist or nationalist, who might be said to take a pragmatic view of what a united Ireland might look like. And I mean, would you agree that perhaps that's why it's wise of the Irish government to take the long view to promote this shared island idea, so that perhaps the Irish government could create a model of what a united Ireland might look like in a detailed, sort of well thought out way, so that that middle in Northern Ireland could look kind of in a cool way at the pros and cons, the material benefits or otherwise of what a united Ireland might look like, rather than have it just bound up with the identity issue, the national question, and so on.
I mean, I do support the Shared Island Unit. I think it's a great initiative. I've taken part in a number of the Shared Island Dialogue series discussions, and I think more dialogue is key here. It creates better understanding, not only between communities in Northern Ireland, but between the North and the South, because there is still a substantial barrier between people in the North and people in the South in terms of understanding. And I think that the Shared Island Unit is doing great work in trying to break down some of those barriers. In terms of the growing middle ground and the possibility of reunification, I do think that Brexit has impacted drastically this idea of reunification or United Ireland, and that people are, looking at this from a different angle now, more pragmatically. This is something that maybe would have only existed in the dreams and hopes and aspirations of nationalists in Northern Ireland. But now it's more of a question of, well, what would that look like? What would the benefits be if it was a United Ireland? Would it be better for my children? Would it be economically better?
People talk about the NHS, for example.
Exactly. But so I think that my own perspective is that there is likely to be a referendum potentially within the next 10 years because the conversation is only increasing, it's not decreasing. We see it now becoming quite mainstreamed in terms of across the media on the island, but also a lot of the political leaders here now are acknowledging that, yes, there is likely to be at some point a referendum. And that places a responsibility on all stakeholders, but in particular on the Irish government and the British government and on Stormont politicians to be prepared and put in all the work that will be required for whenever people do decide that they are wanting to exercise their right to self-determination. Because I think it'll be quite a complicated process. We're dealing with decades of trauma, we're dealing with a mix of identities and culture, and we have to look at issues in terms of education, healthcare, pensions. These are all very complex issues that would have to be ironed out, and it would take, in my view, a number of years to really put in the necessary work to establish what that might look like. And from a civic society perspective, my greatest fear is that we're going to end up having our own form of Brexit where it's not going to be properly ironed out. I would really rather see a process quite similar to that of the Good Friday Agreement, where a copy of the agreement is sent out to every house on the island so that people can make a truly informed decision. And I think we really have a responsibility now to prepare for that outcome and make sure that we're ready.
Yeah. Amanda, if I can just throw that to you there, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that we've all just filled in our census forms in Northern Ireland, taking sort of a snapshot of where we're at, and that was done in the last few weeks. So I think that those figures are going to be fascinating. They are due to be published next year. I think that the last census, people wrongly interpreted those who identified as Northern Irish as meaning something perhaps that it didn't mean. I think that all eyes here are on Scotland and what is happening there. Will there be a second independence referendum? Will that be the sort of trigger point for the breakup of the UK? I think that when we talk about the middle ground in Northern Ireland, those would be the people who would maybe vote for the Alliance Party or for the Green Party, while there are some people within those voting blocks that don't have a strong constitutional position. There are still people within those voting blocks who identify as Unionists and Republicans, but they know that the only vote that counts when it comes to that is the border poll. So they're happy enough to vote for a middle ground party in the meantime, because they know that there's only going to be one border poll, and they have the same vote that everybody else has. I think that the three strands of the Good Friday Agreement are the relationships within Northern Ireland, the relationships between the two jurisdictions on the island, and the relationships between Britain and Ireland. And I think all of those are under pressure at the moment for a variety of reasons, but largely Brexit, because we know the British-Irish relations have been built up over decades, and they're really under pressure at the moment. So I think it's a pretty sort of grim picture at the moment, and so it needs work in all three of those. And whenever it comes down to a border poll, I think that everyone deserves the information ahead of a vote taking place, because we've seen the disaster whenever you don't do that. We've seen what happened with the Brexit referendum when you try to work out what people voted for after the fact. I think that's going to be a serious problem. But unfortunately, no matter what happens, and I think in the medium to long term, it probably will be Irish reunification, I think that work has to go into making people feel secure in their own identity, so that they don't feel left behind, or they don't feel as if they're going to be excluded, or that their opinions or their values or their traditions aren't going to be respected in whatever dispensation comes about.
Great, thanks very much, Amanda. Are there any questions that people would like to throw at the panel now, just as we are coming towards the conclusion? James, are you getting any questions coming in, or
nothing coming through here? Anybody wants to ask a question, use the put up your hand function, or just unmute and put on your camera. I think there are none. I suspect that some people may have misread the timing. We've got some people joining now, forgetting that there's a hour difference between Brussels and Ireland and the UK. In any event, thank you, everyone on the panel, Amanda, Emma, and Robert. Oh, we have a question here from Charles Nelson.
And I made a huge blunder. Just a minute. Yes, I'll just getting my question up right now. Hang on a minute. Yes. Thank you very much. Yeah. Oh God. Yeah, I got it now. The issues regarding the Northern Ireland Protocol, could the protocol issues result in the UK becoming more aligned with the EU and possibly rejoin the single market and customs union at some point in the future, as part of solving the problem?
I can sort of start answering that. I mean, I think it's certainly unlikely in the short term. I mean, there has been some talk about a veterinary agreement between the UK and the European Union, where they would be aligned on food safety and animal health rules. So in that sense, you wouldn't need to have checks and controls on goods going to Northern Ireland. That would obviate the need for about 90%, I think, of the checks and controls. So that's cropping up in the conversation in Brussels, but from what I gather, there hasn't been any traction politically in London. I think Boris Johnson's whole approach is still so much pro-sovereignty. He doesn't want the UK to be in any way hamstrung by having to align with EU food safety rules. They talk about equivalence. They talk about a New Zealand type arrangement, which is a lot softer. But I don't think member states would really buy that. So, I think at the moment they're getting into a very long and technical process to try and see where checks and controls can be made a bit lighter, so long as there isn't a risk of consumer health problems with food safety or animal health, or if there isn't a risk to the integrity of the single market. I don't know, Neil, Richmond, do you want to have any? Do you have any thoughts on?
Yeah, I think certainly if we think back, Tony, to those very, very long nights preceding to Christmas, when a lot of the negotiations about the TCA came down to the concept of absolutist sovereignty. And that is very much at the heart of the Brexit strategy of this current British government. And let's be quite frank, it was sold and packaged in a very politically successful manner. This British government has a huge mandate. Certainly as an elected politician, I'd love a mandate like that. I don't think it's ever going to happen in my lifetime. And I can't see how they are going to all of a sudden abandon that policy to appease very genuine concerns about the protocol. And it's going to require, as this seminar says, Brussels taking an element of responsibility. But I just can't, as much as I've said earlier in the seminar, how much I'd like for the British position, I suppose, to soften and perhaps one day come back into the customs union and the single market, I certainly cannot see it happening. And I think it will be politically very damaging. Like this particular British government, the vast majority of the cabinets are not just Brexiteers, but cabinet members, but are hard Brexiteers. And that's been the core focus of it. And certainly throughout the negotiations, Lord Frost had a very clear mandate when negotiating with Michel Barnier that he wouldn't cross when it came to absolute sovereignty. And that got into issues over equivalence, but also fisheries. And it certainly has made the situation far more difficult in terms of applying the Northern Irish Protocol. That is one solution, but rather we're facing a far more difficult solution that requires an element of political concession from the British government, the European Commission, the Irish government, and the Northern Irish administration, particularly the unionist parties. But ultimately, that concession is agreeing to what's been signed up to already, and yet applying it in a far more common sense manner.
Thanks, Neil. We have a question there from Paul O'Dwyer, is it? If you want to come in there, Paul.
Yeah, thanks. Neil referred to the British negotiating in good faith, but I was following the Brexit stuff, and I can remember way back when Theresa May was trying to do stuff that David Davis, when there was talk of signing something, said that it was just words, and that Michael Gove said, well, look, you can sign it and you can renege on it the following day. And it seems to me that has been the sort of attitude that the British have taken. They'll sign anything to get to the next stage, and particularly when the next stage coming up is getting out. And Neil has said like that they're if you like, ideological Brexiteers in the cabinet, and it's very hard to see how you can actually negotiate forward into the future with people like that, who have a hard ideology like that, who will end up blaming other people, and who really don't care about Northern Ireland or anything else. They're tied up in a sort of an internal crusade that they have. It's very depressing. That's all I can say.
Tony, could I just interject there for a second, just in response to what Charles had asked? That's the grievance of unionists and loyalists within Northern Ireland. They see that Scotland, England and Wales have got Brexit and that they don't. So, to stop checks, the whole staying in the customs union and the single market to many Brexiteers means that you haven't had Brexit. So I think that's one of the major problems, and that's why unionists and loyalists in Northern Ireland feel left behind, as they describe. They feel betrayed by the government because they don't see that they've got the Brexit that everybody else has got. I just find it fascinating from the perspective of being from a devolved nation that voted to remain, that it is the people, it was more people from a unionist community voted for leave than a nationalist community. So it's the version of Brexit that the leavers in Northern Ireland have got that they don't like.
I mean, do you think, Amanda, that the unionists who voted for Brexit perhaps initially weren't with the exception of some of the DUP MPs at Westminster, who, as we know, had fallen into bad company, shall we say, in the ERG. But I mean, do you think that quite a few unionists thought that they were voting for this knowing or believing that it wouldn't be carried, and that it would, give the base something to cheer about? And when it actually did come to pass, they kind of didn't know what to do.
Yeah, I think there's an element of that. I think that there was a sort of gung-ho attitude for Brexit because perhaps they thought that it wasn't going to happen. And now obviously some unionists, didn't back Brexit, and, there was always going to be a border somewhere. And for a variety of reasons, it was never going to be a land border. And, why people are shocked that Northern Ireland has a different arrangement to the rest of the UK when we're on a separate island to Scotland, England, Wales, I find, pretty fascinating. Like, certainly there's definite legitimate grievances there, but to me, that should be directed towards the UK government, who have agreed this with the EU, more so than anyone else. It's not, unionists who are upset. It's not their Irish nationalist neighbours, or it's not the Irish government that have imposed this on them. This is an international agreement between the United Kingdom government and the EU. So for me, the grievance for unionists and loyalists in Northern Ireland should be with the UK government. I'm just concerned about what it means for our future and what it means for the political process here, because we only have devolved government back in Northern Ireland for about a year or so now, after a period of 3 years where it was collapsed. There was no functioning government, and it took the British and Irish government, it took Julian Smith and Simon Coveney to really pull that together to bring it back, and then we immediately went into the COVID pandemic. So it's been a sort of a messed up year, but I think that the intensity of sort of interest and nurturing that's required is absent at the moment. We've heard the Taoiseach call for a summit on what's been happening over the last few weeks, even though Brexit only plays a part of the violence that we've seen unfold. But as I said at the start of this, all the grievances that were there before the street violence unfolded, and all of the different sort of elements in the toxic melting pot, that's all still there. And it's going to require some serious attention from both governments as well as the local politicians to try and diffuse tensions, and perhaps be more measured in the language that we're using when we're talking about this, because if people are constantly told that they're being left behind, or that their Britishness is being diminished or devalued, how do you expect people to react to that sort of constant stream of negativity about who they are? And as I said at the start, there's hundreds of thousands of people in Northern Ireland who are of an Irish identity, and being part of Northern Ireland as part of the UK doesn't make them any less Irish. So I think that we constantly have to repeat that message.
Can I just actually add on to what Amanda's saying there, which I agree with, of course, entirely. But I think that really there is an inherent danger in fanning the flames of instability and anger, which the ramifications of which we're now seeing. And really a lot of the rhetoric that we've heard from political unionism over the last few months since the Northern Ireland Protocol has added to these, fueled these tensions, and really given cover to more nefarious groups within Northern Ireland. I mean, we've always had groups here that have been against the peace process. The problem we have now is that political unionism is in a way giving them cover and reason to be out onto the streets. So I just wanted to add that onto Amanda's point, and also to say that, it's also important to note that not all unionists voted for Brexit. There's always going to be a cohort there as well that didn't vote for Brexit. And that I think there was also a cohort perhaps who hoped that Brexit might have resulted in a border on the island of Ireland. And that's not what happened. And so there's a bit of a pushback from those groups. We see people such as Jim Allister, who has spent his entire political career undermining the Good Friday Agreement and calling for it to be scrapped, and calling for a border on the island of Ireland, taking forward litigation around the Northern Ireland Protocol. So I think that there needs to be a little bit of honesty from those within political unionism who are calling for the Northern Ireland Protocol to be scrapped as to what it is they actually want from that. And I think that we've seen that the desire of some of them might be that they would really prefer to see a border on the island of Ireland, which of course, as we all know in this room, would be entirely unworkable.
Okay, thank you very much, Emma. And I think from Brussels, myself and James will probably wrap things up now because it's getting late. Any other questions? Or
I think we need to close it there, but it's unfortunate this is a Zoom meeting and not an in-person meeting, because I can sense that there's room for plenty of sidebar conversations and continuing this at a bar. That's not possible, but it will be very soon, I hope. However, being an online thing, this will be recorded. This recording will be posted on YouTube, but it will also be posted on our social media platforms, Twitter and LinkedIn, where those interested may continue the debate online. And I encourage you to do so, because it's been very stimulating, very interesting. and very, very much appreciated by us, and as you can see, even by people outside of the European Union, the ambassador there from Canada. United Europe is, as I said, a non-profit association for the promotion of the unity, diversity and competitiveness of Europe. And if you'd like to continue to support us, support our work, you can join and become a member. You'll find everything you need to know on united-europe.eu. Thank you all again on our panel. Thank you, Tony, for moderating. And I look forward to the next one of these discussions being an in-person debate, as I said, in Brussels, in Belfast, in Dublin, in London, who knows. Thank you, everybody, and good night.
Thanks, James, and thanks,
Good night.
everybody.
Thanks
Thanks for the conversation. Thank you. Bye-bye.